Howdy, it's Kyle talking about Dominica. It's a relatively small island in the Caribbean that my wife and I recently returned from visiting, and we had a great time. And this video is going to be talking about tips and practicalities for visitors. Right now, there's some decent information from influencers and travel vloggers talking about things to do and top places to see on the island, but they don't really go into some of the really deep information you have to know if you are going to be visiting there, so that's what this video is going to be. It'll be divided up into 4 different sections, and I'll have a timestamp for each. The first will be a general overview of the island. The second will be talking about transport and getting around the island, because that's going to be your biggest challenge while there. The third will be tips specific to hiking, because if you want to go to Dominica, you're probably wanting to do some hiking. There are some things you really have to know. And the fourth segment will be about cost and budgeting, but spoiler alert, it doesn't have to be very expensive at all. So if you're going to be going to Dominica or you're planning on it, you definitely want to watch this video. Okay, so right away, I want to say it's pronounced Dominica and not Dominica. There is a country called the Dominican Republic, but this island is pronounced Dominica. This is an independent nation that is a part of the UN. The population is about 73,000 people, and there's been some slight growth through the years. The capital is Roseau. There are about 15,000 people there, and with a couple of small suburbs right next to it, there are about 20,000 in the Roseau area. A good majority of the people live on the western coast, especially in the southwestern and northwestern corners of the island. There are not many people living in the mountainous interior and very few living in the southeastern portion of the island. In area, it's approximately 16 by 30 miles or about 290 square miles, and the entire island is mountainous and fairly steep. It goes from sea level to its highest point, which is about 4,700 feet, in less than 4 miles as the crow flies. And if you know how to read topographic maps, check this one out. Most of the island is very steep terrain. It's a former British colony, but is located between 2 parts of France, and as a result, there's a little more French influence on this island than the other former British colonies in the Caribbean. The official language on the island is English, and everybody does speak English, but most people there speak English Creole to each other, and if you only speak English, you'll have a hard time understanding the Creole. In terms of wealth or human development index, it's very middle class on a global scale, although it is fairly poor compared to the US, Canada, EU, Japan, or Australia. So all that to say, this isn't one of those very rich islands like St. Bart's or Anguilla or places like the Cayman Islands or Turks and Caicos that are really expensive for visitors. This isn't one for people to go to for spring break or for partying in general. Don't expect to go shopping at fancy boutiques and possibly bump into a celebrity. It's more of an adventure destination and is often very high on the list of hikers and divers as places in the world for which they like to visit. So now I want to get into what will likely be your biggest challenge with visiting there, and that is getting around the island. Transport and getting from point A to point B on Dominica is not easy. You have 5 options on how to get around this island, none of which are ideal, but I will go into detail of each one. The first option is using taxis. If you're like my wife and I, you thought you're going to go to this island and you're going to get around by using taxis the entire time. But if you're like us, your idea on how to get around this island changed immediately from your first taxi ride. To get from the airport to our hotel cost $100 US. If you're getting around by just taxi, expect to spend at least $100 a day. And for most people, that's not going to be reasonable because with the island being relatively inexpensive to visit, taxis might become one of your most expensive costs while there. And keep in mind, these are the official fares set by the government, so this isn't a case of the taxi drivers trying to rip you off and you have to haggle with them. The thought of spending maybe $1,000 on taxis during your trip isn't really feasible. Well, you have 4 other options. The next option is using the public transportation. Like most of the small islands in the region, you have a bus network. The buses there aren't buses like we know them in larger countries. They're really full-size Japanese vans. They're models of vans they don't export in the US, but they're essentially the same as the summer camp or church vans you may have ridden in. The buses operate here like many other places. The driver is not going to go until the van is full. So they will be crowded, but it's not that bad. But the bigger issue is that they're not really that convenient. If you're using them between 8 and 10 a.m. or between 4 and 6 p.m., they can be great, but during the middle of the day, it can be hard to get one because they're not going to really be filled up and the driver is not going to go anywhere unless the bus is full. So you may have to time your bus rides in the morning or in the late afternoon. Or like what I did a couple of times, I caught one of the bus drivers who was going to be sitting there all afternoon waiting for people to fill up, and it might be several hours. He was like, yeah, I'll take you up there for $10 US. And that would have been a $40 cab ride. So if you're in the middle of the afternoon trying to get a bus out of Roseau, try to find one of the bus drivers that isn't going to have a bus filled up for a few hours. You might be able to get them to take you to where you need to go for maybe $5-10. So taxis are really expensive. Buses might not be convenient. The third option of getting around is walking. So even if you have unlimited funds and you can take taxis, or maybe you're finding the bus system to be very convenient, you are still going to have to walk a lot at some point. And for me, somebody who loves to walk and loves to use my feet as my primary mode of transportation, you will be exhausted walking around Dominica. The terrain is just so steep, you will not be able to get around by foot the entire time. There were times where I had to walk a mile or so and it was basically all uphill. You'll start sounding like an old boomer talking about how they used to get to school uphill both ways. It's somehow always uphill both ways. It's like an M.C. Escher painting. And even if you weren't going to Dominica with the intent of hiking, you're going to end up hiking anyway just by walking around the island. Taxis, buses, and walking are the three modes you will almost certainly have to use at some point. And these last two modes of transportation you might not have to do, but you might very well end up doing anyway. The first is, believe it or not, hitchhiking. I ended up having to hitch a couple times, and it really wasn't that big of a deal. Not gonna lie, I felt a little uncomfortable the first time I had to do that, and the second time I didn't actually have to actively hitch, somebody picked me up. I was on a long uphill stretch walking up a road, guy pulled over, need a ride, and I was like, yes sir, I do. And you'll find people there just super friendly, genuinely just wanting to give you a ride up the hill, not asking for any money. So even if you don't feel comfortable hitchhiking and it's something you don't end up doing at all, just know that it is very common and very accepted there. So that leads me to the fifth option for getting around the island, renting a car. And that normally wouldn't be that big of a deal, but on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the easiest driving ever and 10 we're all going to die, driving on Dominica is like a 9.5. The roads are narrow, windy, and often wet. There's often an open gutter on one side. There's often a big drop-off on one side. Many spots are not wide enough for a truck and you to pass, so you'll have to kind of go off onto the shoulder. There'll be stray dogs and chickens and goats and people in the road. And to top it all off, they drive on the wrong side of the road, because of her. The only saving grace about driving on this island is that because it is so windy and narrow roads, you're driving very slow. So with the speeds being slow and the cars being small, there are no Escalades or Ford F-950s there, so you slam on the brakes, you're going to stop. But nonetheless, driving at 25 miles an hour will never be so scary. But all that to say, I'm not sure what we would have done for those 3 days we had to rent a car. And from a cost perspective, renting a car for 3 days was about the same as using a taxi for 1 day. So now I want to discuss some practicalities for people who were going there to hike. That was certainly my main reason why I wanted to go. I'm an avid hiker. I've been hiking all throughout the Sierra Nevada, the Rocky Mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Green Mountains in Vermont, the White Mountains in New Hampshire. And between all those spots, I've done plenty of long, strenuous hikes. And despite all that, Dominica kicked my butt. There are 4 aspects of hiking on Dominica that might make it a little more extreme than what you were expecting. The first is again the steepness of that terrain. I have hiked on many steep slopes, but some of the hiking here is almost relentlessly uphill. These are photos from the first hike that I did there. It's called the Freshwater Lake. And what this is you're essentially just going continuously uphill to the very top of this ridge. You turn a corner, you're going up and up. And each time you turn a corner, you're thinking, okay, that's got to be about it. Nope. Turn a corner, you're going up again. And the hike is a wonderful hike. The views are beautiful. You'll see some gorgeous mountain scenery you can see out to the ocean. And by the time I was at the top, you could boil an egg on my thighs. But then what happens on all of these trails, they're so steep going up. Well, guess what? They're also really steep going down. And you combine steep with kind of wet and muddy, and you're going to be sitting down and scooting and sliding down some of these really steep sections. And that's a segue into the second part of hiking on Dominica that's going to be a little bit different than what you might be used to. And that is you're going to get wet and muddy. Within the first 10 meters of my first hike on the island, I had to step through a small ankle-deep puddle of mud. And that's no big deal in and of itself. You're certainly not going to be going through anything more than ankle-deep water or mud. But what that means is you can't be wearing hiking boots. They'll be weighed down by the water. You'll also have swampy socks. So what you will definitely want to wear as footwear are something like these. And the first time you step into a puddle there, and that will happen, you'll be glad you're wearing these and not boots. All right, it's super steep. It's wet and muddy. What's the third part about it that makes it difficult? Well, a lot of exposed heights. There'll be spots where you'll have a big drop off on one side and a big drop off on the other side too. So going back to that freshwater lake trail, I got to the bottom of that part where you sit and slide. It was just so steep. This is how it looks going uphill. But as I turned a corner, I saw I was going to have to go onto a really exposed ridge with a big drop off on both sides. So you combine narrow paths with drop offs on both sides and high winds, and I was crawling on my hands and knees across that stretch. And there will be many other hikes on the island where you are faced with exposed ridges and some pretty sketchy drop offs. And so these trails are almost always steep, wet, and often with exposed heights, but those aren't the only things that make hiking there much more difficult. It's also getting to the trailhead in the first place. So you combine what I was saying before about difficulties on getting around the island, you might find yourself having to walk a couple of miles just to get to the trailhead in the first place. So even if you're walking along the roadside for 2 miles, it's effectively doing some hiking because of the steepness of the terrain. So for this freshwater trail hike, I had already had to hike about 3 miles of almost entirely uphill just to get there. So I was already kind of tired before I even started the trail, and then there's this trail I talked about. And despite all that I've been saying, the freshwater lake trail that I've described is considered one of the easiest trails on the island, because most of the other big trails on the island will be that difficult but much longer. So right now there's a national trail called the Waitakabuli National Trail that's kind of like the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Coast Trail in the US. There are 14 different segments throughout the island, and each one has a very different difficulty. While I was there, I did segments 1, 2, and 6. 1 and 2 are both considered pretty easy, but also both have some exposed heights that can be kind of sketchy. So if you want to do a couple of the hikes that are considered difficult even on Dominica standard, like segment 9 and 11, just prepare yourself for some very difficult, extreme hiking. And you might be thinking, hey Kyle, you're really selling hiking on Dominica here. And I don't mean to say all these things as a deterrent, but just as a heads up. And as a recommendation, if you're going to train for hiking on Dominica, one word, thighs. Now I'm certainly no gym rat or kinesiologist, but you will need some thighs of steel. And I will certainly go back and do some of the more difficult trails, but I have to train differently the next time I go. And the last bit of practicalities I want to talk about is how much does it cost to go there and what should you budget? Like most other places, you can go upscale and make it very expensive, but if you're on a tight budget, you can definitely have a great time there. The biggest cost might very well be just getting there in the first place. We came from the southeastern US, so it wasn't as expensive, but it ultimately comes down to how cheaply can you get to Miami. If you can get a good deal on a flight to Miami, there's a weekly nonstop flight from Miami to Dominica. But if getting to Miami in the first place might be a long flight or otherwise expensive, it can make the overall trip to Dominica expensive, but once you're on the island itself, it really isn't that pricey. Here's a handful of places I pulled up on Expedia right before I did the recording for this video. Here's a private cottage you can rent for $75 a night. It's nothing fancy, but it's detached and you have a private bathroom. Here's a more hotel type place with an ocean view for $117 a night, although you wouldn't get my fancy member 10% off price. This is a nicer place on the beach for $147, and that's pretty expensive for Dominica. Here's another private cottage you can rent for $105 a night. There are a lot of guest houses that are kind of like B&Bs. You can stay in one of those for $60 a night. If my wife sees this video, she'll see this one and be like, why didn't we stay here? That's a good question. This is one where I probably would have stayed if I would have known more about it. And yes, there are a couple of expensive fancy luxury hotels and some luxury eco resorts, but you can easily get a place for well under $100 a night. And say you're a group of 3 or 4 friends that wants to go hiking in these mountains, you can split one of these guest houses and it'll be really cheap. Food on the island is fairly cheap as well, as long as you're not going to the restaurants that are geared towards tourists. If you're eating where the locals eat, it's going to be cheap. Street food and local restaurants, you can easily get by on $25 a day. Using the buses is really cheap. It might cost you $1 or $2 for a long route. A national park pass that is good for the entire week to all the national park sites on the island is only $12. But I'm going to bring it all back to taxis, which are crazy expensive. With some of those places to stay being well under $100 a night, you could easily spend $100 a day just on taxis. And very lastly, I want to quickly mention the beaches. For most of the Caribbean islands, the first thing you talk about are the beaches, but for Dominica, it's certainly not the main thing you go for. But with that being said, there are some truly gorgeous beaches there. It's just that most of them you're going to have to walk or even hike down to. And it wasn't very difficult at all for my wife and I to find a spot on the beach where there was really nobody else around. So it takes a little effort to get to the beaches, but if you're there, you're going to go hiking. So hiking down to the beach is certainly no big deal, especially when these are the rewards. So Dominica, I love it. I will certainly go back one day, and if you go there, you will want to go back a second time as well. So those are my tips and practicalities for visiting Dominica, and even though some of this might have seemed kind of negative, I don't want it to come off like that, but these are things you really do have to know if you are going to visit. We had a wonderful time there, so if you were to ask me would I return, I'd reply with, I'd move there. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerd. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out my Patreon page, and the link is in the description. And as always, thank you very much.